Really great to be here to talk about a Sustainable Food Fibres Futures project that we've got running in Canterbury. So as Jeff mentioned, I lead the beneficial biodiversity team in Lincoln, so it's focused on insects. We are most interested in trying to get biodiversity on farms that's going to provide benefits to farmers, and also, so native plantings is one aspect. You've got all the other aspects of the life cycles of these insects as well that we're also interested in. But this project is just focused on native plantings. So it's a 5-year project. We're about halfway through it at this stage. We've got a whole heap of partners who have been really great and supportive of this project. They represent primary industry bodies such as FAR and Beef and Lamb, companies, Synlait, Palmu, and then we've got people that plant out the plants. So there's commercial industries that do it for farmers, and also we've got conservation trusts like Te Ara Kakariki. So, and also the councils, regional and local councils as well. So really great mix of people that are interested in land use and have good communication abilities to farmers and other landholders. So firstly, the native plants we're talking about, we're using a whole heap of sites across Canterbury. These sites aren't designed specifically, they're planted for all sorts of reasons. So they're the sorts of native plantings that we're examining for beneficial insects. If we take Canterbury as a whole, Canterbury is a really intensively farmed area. It's got a very simplified landscape. It has less than 0.5% of remnant vegetation left. So an environment like this, globally, it doesn't support much biodiversity. So similar areas around the world just don't support much biodiversity. In terms of farmers, there's been a real interest in re-establishing native plants. The reasons for establishing plantings aren't simple. So there's a whole lot of reasons that come into play. This data is part of the project that we're doing, where we want farmers to fill in a questionnaire to tell us what they think are native plantings and what benefits they provide them. If you have a chance, take down that address and get onto it and give us your feedback of what you think around native plantings. It's also an opportunity for us to give you information as it comes along. As we develop the information, we can email it to an email list. So in terms of the results, you can see things like animal biodiversity is quite a frequent reason. There's other aspects such as aesthetics. In the red columns, that highlights beneficial insect services, so pest control and pollination. We think this is a bit artificially high because a lot of the people that fill in the survey already get information about what's going on, so they probably overemphasise those services. But the highlight is, as was talked about, the economics. The reason for planting are really variable, and you know, getting pleasure out of it is important to a lot of people. So in this project, we're focused on 2 main groups of beneficial insects: crop pollinators. So in terms of crop pollinators, we all know the honeybee is really important. In Canterbury, farmers rely on it. They pay for the services of honeybees to help pollinate the crops. We know that a range of our wild bees, so bumblebees, and our native bees also pollinate crops. It can be really effective pollinators of crops. In terms of those native bees, mostly they're ground nesting. So native plants can support pretty much their whole life cycle. So they've got the pollen and nectar to feed and collect, and then they've got the undisturbed soil associated with the native plantings. Besides bees, there's a whole range of flies that are and other insects that are really not considered to a great extent, but they can be just as efficient as bees in a number of cases. And in some cases, like hybrid crops, we've actually found that some flies are more efficient pollinators than honeybees in those crops. So there's areas of insects that we just haven't valued enough, that if we can get into the system, then they're going to help with the pollination. The other area is the natural enemy side. Murph talked a lot about it and showed all of those pictures of those maggots and things crawling around and attacking insects. But the important thing is that a lot of these insects also, the adult feeds on nectar and pollen resources. So if you take the small hoverfly, we call it the orange hoverfly, it all gets confusing, that will feed on a range of native plant species. It pollinates crops, it visits crops and puts pollen on stigmas. So it's got a dual benefit. It can be a pollinator, lays its maggots that then go and attack soft-bodied insects. A number of these can be pests, diamondback moth caterpillars that can munch away at cabbage moth eggs and various aphids. Non-pest soft-bodied insects as well. So, you know, the native habitat might support the larvae of these insects as well, so it keeps a population on the farm. Another sort of really great insect is the ginger blisterfly. So the bristleflies are a group of, well, they're called tachinids. They're parasitoids of all sorts of insects. Some are quite specialised in that parasitism. In this case, ginger blister flies lay their eggs on piranha moths, and piranha moths are a pasture pest. So it's quite specialised on piranha moths. The native plants will feed the adults, and the adult is a pollinator too. And then Murph also showed lacewings and the nasty bitey bits on the larvae. Now both of these will eat pest aphids, but they can also be found on native plants as well, and can also attack the native aphids as well. So that's kind of fits into the SNAP idea around providing alternative hosts for the insects so that they're present on farm. So if you start getting pest build-up, you've already got a population there ready to build up as well. Okay, so in this talk I'm going to present a number of networks, so ecological networks, and this is kind of, I mean, people get a bit challenged by it because scientists use it a lot. They've developed a lot of jargon, they look at the patterns and have all of these sorts of words that are really confusing if you delve too deeply in it. But in an observational sense, they still tell you a lot. So someone like me, I can interpret them pretty well, you know, just by the complexity. Complexity is usually a really good thing in these networks. This is a really simple network. Honeybee pollinating a couple of crops. So there's these red lines are the interactions. So you've got two interactions in this system. If you've got two crops and you're relying on honeybees alone to pollinate the crop. However, if you lose the honeybee in this system, then you had it. Like, you're just not going to get pollination of these crops. By promoting diversity of pollinators, you're going to get more insects providing additional pollination to these crops. That means if you lose the honeybee out of the system, you're still going to get pollination out of these crops, on these crops. Now, honeybees don't necessarily physically have to lose them. The weather can be crap, so other insects can forage under cool, cloudy conditions, so you'll still get some pollination when honeybees aren't doing it. Honeybees are also quite fussy, so they might find something preferred, go and tell all their mates in the hive, they all fly off, and then the farmer is not getting much of a great job done by honeybees. Now, some of these insects may actually have a preference for these crops, so they're going to be in the crop. So it's all a resilience aspect. So by building up that biodiversity, it means when some insects aren't active, you're going to have other insects that can do the job. So when we talk about networks for beneficial insects, what we want to see is a real tangled web that shows resilience on the farm. So in terms of native plants, you've got these, well, I should start that globally there's been quite a lot of study on native habitat and the effects on beneficial insects. The studies generally look at the native habitat as a whole. They don't tease out species. The results that come through can be positive, but sometimes they're quite neutral. So we propose, by understanding the various plants within a community and what their interactions are with the insects, that gives opportunities to design habitat that's going to target the insect species that you want. So going to the project, we've been looking at a whole lot of farms, dairy farms, arable farms, sheep and beef farms, comparing older established native plantings with newly established plantings, so ones that have gone in within the year, with bare fence lines on farms that have established native plants, so 400 plus metres away from the native plants, and also control farms, control bare fence lines where they haven't planted native plantings. So when I talk about treatments, that's what I'm talking about: old native plantings, new native plantings, control bare fence lines on farms without native plantings, and the bare fence lines on the farms. So looking at these various treatments, we've been using various methods to assess beneficial insects. So we've been using various trapping methods, these window traps, that yellow container with a white perspex vein on it. We have used pitfall traps. We've been doing sweep netting. So all of these measures are looking at the biodiversity associated or next to these treatments, such as the native plantings, but as a whole. They're not considering individual plant species. We've also been considering individual plant species, so observing flower visitors on these native plants, bashing different species of native plants for other sorts of beneficial insects, also noting down pests as well. And one of the important aspects is we've been focusing on a wide range of plants, but having different flowering times as well. So trying to cover plants that flower throughout the year, because the idea is that if you can get a mix of plant species together that flower throughout the year, you're going to support the life cycles longer. You're not going to have that suddenly they're starving because they don't have anything to feed on. And generally, for the networks I'll show, I keep that order. So it's a useful way to look at the patterns of the complexity to see what's happening throughout the year as well. And the other aspect that we're looking at, so we're looking at all of those insects, their presence on farms associated with native plantings. We're also trying to measure the services as well. So are they pollinating crops or crop plants? So we've been placing out brassica, flowering brassica, doing various treatments on them. So we've been doing hand pollinations to maximise the pollination. We've been just leaving flowers exposed for pollination that's naturally occurring from the association with the treatment. And that difference tells us if there's a yield problem, a problem with the yield. So how much extra yield could you potentially get between those differences? The other aspect, I forgot to put a kale slide on. So kale is the one that we're using to look at pest species and biological control. So just like the pak choi, we're putting kale plants out at these various treatment sites, and then leaving them for several weeks and monitoring what's happening with the pests and what's happening with the natural enemies as well over time. So going on to some results, one of the really interesting things is just the underreporting of beneficial insects on these native plants. So we're just finding really like a lot of species in a place like the Canterbury Plains, which is just, lacks so much vegetation. There is actually a lot of biodiversity there that's beneficial to the farm. And this is the first network. So what we go to, so these are the plant species down the side here. These are various insects down the side that are beneficial. So in 2013, on these plant species, we only knew of 73 interactions. Through the study so far, we've identified, I think it's 530 under that green thing. But you can see the complexity there. And don't forget, I said I'd ordered them in the time of flowering. The really cool thing here sorry, I should get out of the way. The really cool thing here is you can see that those interactions go right through. So you've got these species like bristleflies, hoverflies, interacting right up with these early flowering plants, right down through to the plants that are flowering, right even, that one here flowers in winter. So having all of these plants, they not only attract a whole range of beneficial insects, but the insects are there for a really long period of time as well. So that's also really promising. So what's highlighting is that we've got a lot of native plants. They might be New Zealand native plants, but they're quite there's a lot of generalist ones out there that will just attract a lot of beneficial insects to them. This here is a similar slide, but just looking at the hoverflies alone. So we know hoverflies are good pollinators. Several of them are natural enemies as well. So some of the natural enemies are the small hoverfly or the orange hoverfly, the big hoverfly, the black hoverfly I call them. And you can see here that they're persisting in environments for a long period of time and interacting with pretty much all of these plant species. Generally, it seems like the hoverflies as a whole are pretty generalist. So, you know, they'll go to a whole range of flowers. This network is again on hoverflies, but here we've changed the native plants to sites. So native plant sites, and what we've recorded on cabbage trees alone at each individual site. So you can see here, again, this species here, which is a pollinator and has predatory larvae, is really abundant on cabbage trees and is present right across the site. So it doesn't mean, so that what that means is that in Canterbury, if you establish a native planting, you know, you're pretty much going to get it. Even if you're in a really sort of surrounded by open fields, it tends to be there. So it also demonstrates that, you know, if you've got a whole region, then there's certain insects that you're pretty much guaranteed to get no matter where you put your native plants. So in terms of what that means to the farm, it gives you some sort of confidence that you're going to get insects if you plant your native plants. This is the plant beatings, and what it highlights is essentially, again, there's a range of native plant species here, but we're getting other species that we wouldn't normally get just doing observations of flowers like harvestman, the brown lacewings as well, and we're demonstrating that these are also can be found on a range of native plant species as well. So it's just expanding the range of beneficial insects through that method. Our trap data, here we've got the different treatments. We've got a couple of extra ones. We've got single species old flax here and single species newly planted flax. In the first year here, 2021-22, you can see the abundance and diversity of the insects at the old native plants is higher than bare fence lines, which is down here. Flax was really poor here, but for some reason, here it was flowering, so the flowering appears to have brought in a ton of insects at that one point, so that is most likely to explain that difference there. But you can see that there's a pattern there from year to year where the old natives are supporting more beneficial insects compared to bare fence lines. Sweep netting around the native plants. We're getting, again, the old mixed natives. If we sweep net adjacent to those, we're getting higher abundances of beneficial insects compared to the two bare fence treatments here with the new mixed natives in between. So that's one sampling period, that's the second sampling period, so pretty consistent between the two. However, when we sweeped in the middle of the field, so we sweeped around these treatments adjacent, but if we go into the middle of the field, we lose it pretty much. So it looks like it's pretty much at the moment showing signs of being most prominent around the native plantings, and it's not carrying out so much in terms of biodiversity out into the middle of these big fields. Okay, moving to the Pak Choi work where we're looking at pollinators visiting. So in this work we sat there for a day, observed all the insects visiting the flowers, then we also looked at seed set later. But when we observed Pak Choi placed near the, we've got it around this way, so the old plantings, we've got really nice diversity. The size of that bar highlights the amount of activity we were getting there in terms of visitation. So higher visitations of insects that are going to pollinate the crop at these old plantings, and also we also did gardens here. Lasioglossum really stands out here at these old native plantings in particular compared to the bare fence line. So that's one that's really sort of locally abundant, associated with old natives.
What was that? I missed the word.
Sorry, which word?
You
missed it.
Particularly abundant.
So native bee, Lasioglossum, also got a common word of sweat bee. This is comparing across 3 different dairy farms where they so one of the farming companies there established really kind of nice, like 6 farms, well, I think they did 9 farms, but some were together, where they did the same pattern of planting. They just went hell for leather in these farms. So they're all really nicely replicated. So we're seeing also that pattern play out that I showed in the last slide. Sorry, I'll go back to the last slide because I forgot to talk about diversity. So on average, in the number of taxa that we're seeing visiting, you can see there was 8.2 for old plantings, bare fence lines, and control lower. So that's another thing, diversity. So yeah, moving on to this one, you're seeing the pattern of the Lasioglossum, the sweat bees here, really favouring these older native plantings on all of the farms, and not being. In this site, it was also visiting one of the control sites to a small degree, but you can just see really clearly the pattern there. So yeah, certain species are really standing out in terms of their association with native plants. And another exciting result that we've been getting is the seed set. So I talked about how we hand pollinated to get a measure of the maximum seed set. Then we compare that with the open pollinated. We also had fully bagged controls, which are those in the blue. So they didn't really set any seed if you didn't expose them to insects. But what we're seeing in the old natives is not really much of a yield deficit. Here it's pretty much across. The new natives, there is more of a deficit. Not in this year, but they're a year older in this year. So we're actually, maybe it's just a year has made the difference. But compared to these and the bare fence line and the control farms, you can see there's deficits there. So that's really cool. So that's really exciting, getting that result. Okay, now kales. Kale is more complicated. So when we sum up the insects visiting kale over 7 weeks, what we found was, and I'll just talk a bit about this because these pinky purpley colours are all white cabbage, white butterfly, but different stages. So we've got eggs and we've got the caterpillars here as well at different ages. What's key is that most of this is eggs. So, you know, that's potential for damaging, causing damage to the cabbage, to the kale. But what we're finding is most of it's eggs. If you took the eggs off, then you go to caterpillars, there's still a slight increase in old mixed natives, but it doesn't look as dramatic as the eggs. So what we think is something's coming along and munching the eggs in between. So the native plantings seem to be affecting white cabbage butterfly where the white cabbage butterfly is more likely to lay eggs on the kale near natives. But what we're seeing is a lower effect in terms of the larvae development. In terms of other pests, really, really minor. So it's really hard to tease out anything from the lack of pests that we got across all of the treatments. We did get some aphids and the odd diamondback moth, but yeah, not really much to go with there. If we look at the natural enemies associated with the kale, really clear increased numbers of natural enemies on the old mixed and new mixed natives compared to the treatment, bare fence lines and control farms, so that's positive. If we look at the percentage that were parasitised of the cabbage white butterfly, we're also seeing patterns there where if we take the bare fence lines, the control and off-farm and the treatment, what we're seeing is really sort of variability where some sites getting pretty okay parasitism rates of the caterpillars, others are hardly getting any at all. In the new mixed natives, interestingly, really high parasitism. This site here, we had a problem with the cows munching it, so that's why that's like way down there. And the old mixed natives, we're sort of seeing a peak here as well. So you can see the patterns there, they're different. And there's periods of higher parasitism associated with native plants. I kind of threw these slides in. We didn't really get much of a problem with aphids at all, but they were showing some tantalising, I would say. I wouldn't say definitive in any sense of the word, but tantalising in that aphids were generally peaking in abundance at the bare fence lines, more so than the other sites. The yellow line here, which is relatively low, is the native plants, the older native plants. And then our parasitism, though, of these aphids was most responding with the native plants. Here there's hardly anything, but there that's kind of interesting. Okay, we're getting close to the end. So I've talked about native plants in general. These native plantings, pretty much not designed, put in for various reasons, as listed at the beginning. What we think, though, is given the teasing out of the species and the associations with insects that we know perform the services we want, pollination, pest control, there's opportunities to design habitats fit for purpose for that farm. So long as we know what the insects are that we're targeting, and then we know what the associations are with the native plants, then we can use those as a broad basis for coming up with a list of plant species. Now, farmers can't just plonk them anywhere. You know, they might have a dry site, they may have overhead irrigation issues. So they'll have to think around that. But if they have the list of species that they know are going to help them with services, then they can design that into the whole planting scheme. So that's basically a roadmap that we prepared and published with regards to designing or going about figuring out and designing native habitat. And covers, you know, you can apply it anywhere basically, not just New Zealand. I also wanted to say, understanding those plants and what they attract, we can understand more about remnant vegetation, what the value of that might be on farms. So with woodland remnant vegetation in Canterbury, we already predict that there's going to be at least 307 interactions there associated with remnant woodland vegetation. So rather than thinking of this remnant vegetation as just something that's there, it actually may have quite a bit of value. So overall, what we hope to provide is landholders to know more about native plants. Landholders to know more about beneficial insects so that they can consider that into when they're developing their plantings. We want our industry bodies to go out there and help us get the messages out of our findings as they come through. And also that beneficial insect biodiversity is a key reason for establishing on-farm native habitat. So I'll leave it there. Thanks. One of the things that's happened in the past and going on into the future is that people have their, you know, just because of the funding source, you've got your own specific projects and you've got your own favoured methods that are often applied, and it's hard to link the two. So I think there needs to be an opportunity to be able to correlate methods with each other and then go forward with that. But all of this data that's sitting there currently isn't used to its maximum potential. If we can find a way to correlate those methods and that data, then yeah, we could do a hell of a lot more with it. So I'm really feeling optimistic. I mean, we've demonstrated even with these plantings, they can bring in a lot of diverse insects, a lot of native insects. I mean, I'm thinking of a select group, beneficial insects. So maybe some of the rarer species aren't there. So that's someone else's study to do. But in terms of trying to build resilience in these systems, I think, you know, incorporating the natives into the system is going to create biodiversity for you that is going to have interactions on the farm. The other aspect that I think is, if we're thinking beyond just beneficial insects to biodiversity per se, agricultural industries are interested in native plantings, but I don't feel that there's enough communication happening between different organisations that have got different focus. So that's what's really cool about this project. So we've got conservation trusts working with primary industry. So they don't normally talk together, but this has brought them together and they're all on the same page. That's wonderful. As we do a lot more observations of plant species, so if we take New Zealand as a whole, we can get an idea of, okay, these sorts of plant species attracting these sorts of insects. We've got a project, Operation Pollinator, where we're also looking at biodiversity and coming up with lists that are trying to attract, but we don't have the ability at the moment to look at the plant-specific insects associated with the flowers on that. So trying to just build up that data on individual plant species means that you can almost go, if you know what the pollinators are and the natural enemies and the pests, if you take all of those three things into account, then you can come up with a big database and apply it across a whole range of systems and over a bigger area. So that's, maybe I'm being naive, but that's my vision. So at the moment, you know, like you saw, this project is pretty full on. It's exciting, and we're only halfway through it. So this is exciting that we've still got a couple more years. We have talked, I mean, Murph and I have talked about exotics and natives, and I think there's a place, definitely a place for them, and thinking about designs using the combination. Like, there's a lot of potential in just farm design per se, getting away from just native plants. What do the insects need for their other parts of their life cycles? Do we need good wetlands that will support certain hoverfly larvae so that they can always be in the system doing pollination, for example?